Welcome to the Open Lectures on Freemasonry. Today's session will be yours truly. My name is Brother Oscar Alleyne. I am the current Junior Grand Warden of the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons in the state of New York for the 2018-2021 term. It feels a bit funny introducing yourselves. I usually try to keep things to one sentence, but there's a bio that I must present to some extent. So speaking in third person, I lecture in that regard, I would say, internationally on historical, ritualistic, and philosophical and leadership and other topics of interest on Freemasonry, especially as it pertains to research and education. I am a member of several Masonic research and invitational bodies, and also had a couple ranks and honors with respect to receiving the 33rd degree from the Supreme Council of the Northern Masonic Jurisdiction's Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite. I am also the fellow and third vice president of the Philalethes Research Society, as well as a fellow and first vice president of the Masonic Society. Outside of the Masonic territory, I am a national leader in epidemiology and public health with a doctorate in public health from the New York Medical College, and I'm presently the chief program officer for the National Association of County and City Health Officials, which is a national body that is responsible for the 3,000 local health departments across the United States of America. Okay, enough of that. If I can now, divulge into today's conversation from a Masonic perspective, I will be given a lecture on an interesting gentleman by the name of Count de Saint Laurent. So let me start the screen sharing. Visual thumbs up if you're seeing the screen. Thank you. Great. That's back in my call. Okay. So today's conversation is about the legend, the Masonic legend of Count Roume de Saint Laurent. Now, I must start the story in the history with this particular description of Count de Saint Laurent. It is said in 1832 they arrived in the city of New York, the Count of Saint Laurent. He was a member of the Supreme Council of France and the Grand Commander at Vitam of the Supreme Council 33rd for Terra Firma, New Spain, South America, Puerto Rico, Canary Islands, etc. There he found the old council sleeping in consequences of political and anti-masonic troubles existing at that time. That was written in 1861 by Robert Folger. We see in 1832, or I should say roughly about 1840s, John James Gorgas, who was the Sovereign Grand Commander, which is the leader of the Supreme Council of the Northern Jurisdiction, Scottish Rite, wrote the following about Roume Saint Laurent. In description of him coming into New York City, he actually describes him as, in his capacity as being this sovereign grand commander. Gorgas says that all of this is a barefaced imposture because such a council could not exist, nor exist except for his own formation and in his own brains. Gorgas goes on to even say again that Roume was a mulatto who originally came from Domingue, Haiti in other terms, but at present is in Paris, and where he is located as an active member of the aforesaid Parisian Supreme Council for France. So here's this dilemma. In one instance, we see a significant discussion about Roume Saint Laurent being an imposter, someone who is a charlatan, someone who is a great pretender. But on the same token, recognizing that he's actually an active member of the Supreme Council of Scottish Rite in France. So there must be more to this particular story. Well, the key element that is also important to this conversation is a document called the Grand Constitutions of 1786. And forgive me for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite or the Ancient Accepted Rite, depending on where you come from. There's a lot that is said about this particular document within the history of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite that is referred to as the Grand Constitutions of 1786. In short, these grand constitutions essentially lay out the framework for how supreme councils can be created across the world. And with that said, it is quite remarkable because we find the Latin version of this grand constitutions, which was adopted in France and other places and other places, were actually contained in the Golden Book that was owned by this same Count Roume de Saint Laurent. Now, the story goes that the Grand Constitutions was sanctioned and developed by the King Frederick of Prussia. Now, the argument is historically that doesn't make sense. There may have been a more recent derivation of when those grand constitutions were created, but they were in fact accepted across several Supreme Council's bodies as being a legitimate document to define how and when Supreme Councils can be developed, give or take whether they were true or not. Now, I say this because you have to ask this question. Well, who was this man, Roume de Saint Laurent, and how did he have access to these grand constitutions to be able to present them for the first time across the world, and especially the Masonic lexicon? So in order to do that, we must find out, well, who exactly was he? So when you do a search on Roume Saint Laurent or Count de Saint Laurent, you end up with two particular gentlemen that are rising to the top of your searches. The first was a man by the name of Philippe Rose Roume de Saint Laurent. His mother named Rose de Gane de Chancelier, and his father, Laurent Philippe Roume de Saint Laurent. He was known to have been born in the island of Grenada, that is in the Caribbean at that time. He served as a magistrate and a civil commissioner and was a member of the Institute of France. Now, Philippe, just for those of you who may need the geographic reference, the area that I'm speaking here, this green dot in the Caribbean Sea, is the island of Grenada. And just below that is the island of Trinidad. If you go to the right, that is the island of Barbados. And of course, you could see the rest of the Caribbean islands, which you may have a better understanding of. So here is the landscape of which I'm speaking of. So we know that Philippe was born in around 1743. Now, the interesting thing about the island of Grenada, it was, of course, originally by the native indigenous folks at that time, the Arawaks. And then, of course, the French came in. And once the French landed, they actually ruled until the British essentially overthrew the French. And they fought for possession of the island in 1763. So this shift politically in the governance of the island actually had a significant impact on the population at that time, especially the free Black population. As was mentioned, Roume's loyalty was actually questioned during the shift, this transition from French to British. And he and others were expelled from Grenada in around 1776 for impact or issues, as we would say, political perspectives. Now, because his allegiance was questioned, was he on the British side or on the French side? He essentially said he's going to pack ship and pack up things and leave Grenada, and he traveled to Trinidad. While in Trinidad, he was able to identify that the island was still largely undeveloped. He friended the Spanish officer who was in charge of doing surveillance and trying to identify ways of populating and developing the island at that time. And he joined him in ways of saying, hey, let's create a strategy for developing incentives for folks to settle on this island. And let's bring this opportunity and also include the tiny island of Tobago in with this entire perspective. And those of you who know, Trinidad is essentially a twin island nation of Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So Roume had actually made the suggestion of keeping the two islands together for that perspective. So he traveled first to England and then to Madrid in order to meet with the governor, in order to meet the Count Galvez at that time. Galvez was the minister for the Indies. And when Roume had presented his particular recommendation, Galvez initially wasn't willing to share the credit and gave permission for it, but didn't give the credit to Roume. In fact, Roume, we see, had actually petitioned to get his reimbursement for his travel. Nonetheless, it was never repaid. But this is important because when you look at the history of the island of Trinidad in their museum, they actually show you and speak about this survey, the cedula of the population in 1783, which was approved. And of course, we see an image of Philippe Roume de Saint Laurent, who is credited for advancing this opportunity. Now, with that said, moving from Trinidad, we go to the island of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti. Saint-Domingue was actually a very vital component of the French economy. It was essentially, as a colony, one of its greatest moneymakers. And we see by 1791, Roume was appointed to be part of this by the National Assembly of Paris, to be part of a 3-man commission to address some of the issues that were happening on the ground in Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, specifically the several revolutions that were underway. Now, they ran into trouble the first time they got there. In fact, several of the commission's policies and positions were challenged by the white settlers and the white planters at the time. And we found that 2 of the commissioners departed rather rapidly, including Roume later, who also left because of the tensions at that time. And he returned to France in 1792. Then we know that they tried again. And in 1796, he returns to Saint-Domingue as part of this 3rd attempt at this development of a commission. And he, in this time, actually had better relationships and was found favor, especially with the blacks, the free blacks in Saint-Domingue. Now, what is also interesting is that Roume essentially had forged a great friendship with Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture, if any of you do know, is the gentleman who was responsible for the liberation of and the independence of Haiti from the French. And essentially, Roume became what was, lack of a better word, the ambassador to France in Haiti. So this friendship had actually developed between the 2 men. Now, what is interesting about Toussaint, as much as he was a philanderer himself, he actually wanted to end the open practice of whether it was military men or men in power of keeping mistresses, especially around mulatto or the African descendant population at the time. So this kind of forced pressure really led to Roume to having to end his own first marriage, which was with Frances Wilhelmina Lambert, and engendering a second marriage with the woman whom he was really involved in the most, which was Marianne Elizabeth Rochard Lepine, who was also a Black woman with mixed heritage. She was mixed with Black and Native American indigenous, who was born on the island of Grenada, the same island there where he was born. Now, not all was good with the friendship with Toussaint. We know that because Roume's position as being the ambassador or the agent for Paris or France on the island, he was privy to several of the political and other, military style information. And at one point in time, when the Haitians were concerned, and Toussaint and his company were concerned about the advances in the Spanish side of the island, with the Spanish coming in to bring in additional troops to help, attack them. They felt that Roume had information that he should be able to share with them. And in an effort to really squeeze this information out of him, he was held captive in a chicken coop for a number of days in a remote part of the island. This treatment by a man who was, for lack of a better word, in high society, was a high dignitary, was very humiliating for Philippe. And he was very angry with Toussaint. And we find this entire disintegration of their relationship, whereas Toussaint expels Roume no shortly after this event had occurred. Now, what does that mean? We know that we find that Philippe, after being expelled out of Haiti, finds himself in Philadelphia before returning back to Paris. We know this because in 1802, we see that he is elected to be part of the American Philosophical Society in Pennsylvania, which was founded by none other than Benjamin Franklin. Here you see that Philippe Rose Roume, member of the French National Institute, was elected to office elected to membership in the American Philosophical Society. Then we also know another interesting fact about Philippe. This particular image in the middle, is one of the first images that we know existed of Toussaint Louverture. And it is based off of a drawing that Toussaint had given to Roume. And he, once he got to Philadelphia, he shared it with other folks. And once he got to Paris, he additionally shared it. And this was one of the first images that people actually had a depiction, a realistic depiction of Toussaint Louverture. So whenever you see this image or versions of it, recognize that it only came to fruition by virtue of this gentleman called Philippe Rose Roume de Saint Laurent. So Haiti had its victory with its independence, and we know this essentially marked the end of Roume's ability to really be an active member in the Haitian society at the time, especially given of his interactions and his allegiance to France. So he leaves, of course, Philadelphia. He ends up in Paris towards the end of 1802, and he's known to have died in 1804. And here you see a record of his death. Now, why did I go through that painstaking approach of walking you through Philippe? Well, he had a very significant Masonic membership. We know that it's said that he is a member of a lodge, York Lodge in Haiti. We know that he was actually also a member of a chapter Rose Croix called the Chapter of Verity, in addition to a lodge called Lodge of Verity, or Lodge of Truth. Verite, sorry, forgive me. And we know this because the records are very much clear with respect to those individual lodges and record of his membership. But there's another Count de Saint Laurent. You see, I mentioned his second marriage to Marie-Anne Elizabeth de Rochard-Lépine. Philippe married this woman, and she is said to have had a son by the name of Marie-Antoine Nicolas Alexandre Robert Jacquin, who was born on January 21st, 1784. And we know this because we have not only evidence of his birth certificate and his baptism record, which you find here, but that we also know that Philippe adopted young Marie. But as with anything, when you think about the complexity of his name, we've actually were able to find other evidence that points to possibly a gentleman by the name of Alexander Antoine Jacquin, who we suspect who was in that same period of time of being in St. Lucia in 1784 and being active in the lodge, that possibly could have been the biological father of Jacquin, of Marie. But moving ahead, the French historian Etienne Paul Nedon had actually, in his estimation, when he wrote about Philippe Rose Roume de Saint Laurent, he considered that Marie Antoine may have been the natural son being born out of wedlock. But the evidence pretty much shows, in some cases, otherwise. But here's an interesting fact that is going to be very important to our story. As I mentioned, Philippe Rose adopts Marie Antoine, or Jacquin as we would call him for short. In 1799, March 11th, this particular ceremony was approved in the magistrates in the courts in Haiti. What is interesting is that instead of being shown as being born in 1784, January 21st, which we have evidence of his baptism records and his birth records, they changed his date to be January 21st, 1774, essentially making the young man 10 years older. Now, what is interesting about this particular adoption record, it was signed and approved by Charles César Télémaque and François Terreblanc, who were the clerk and the magistrate at that time. Now, you may ask, well, why am I making such a big deal about this particular adoption record? Well, two things. First, we see that this adoption record, it is clearly written that Marie-Antoine Nicolas Alexandre Robert is from this day on and forth regarded as the adopted son, enjoying the prerogatives and the rights attached to this quality as if he were the legitimate son of our Philippe Rose. And it also gives him the right to enjoy all of his inheritances, in addition to the ability to use his name, including that of Count Roume de Saint Laurent. So here's the act that essentially permits Marie Antoine the ability to use the title of Count Roume de Saint Laurent. What is interesting about this adoption record is also the following. The Justice of Peace and the clerk that signed it were actually junior members of the same lodge that we know Philippe Rose was an advanced and senior member of. So think about it in this way. Here you have this gentleman who is definitely in high society. He is, in fact, the agent of France, the French ambassador, who is a member of this Lodge of Truth. We know that he is well known and well liked to that extent, enjoying great privileges. We also know that there are two new members of the Lodge. Both are the clerk and justice of the peace, Telemaque and Terra Blanc. And of course, we see that they're the ones who sign off on this adoption record for Philippe to adopt his stepson. And of course, we see a date change as far as the date of birth by a 10-year differential. So when you think about all of this, you're like, okay, well, there's some nuances. What difference does it all make, or why is it all tied together? Well, in Haiti, there was an opportunity that Philippe took advantage of to get him and other children, associated with dignitaries and others in the high elite in Haiti to be educated in France. You see, this process allowed for him to send up to 7 men of color, young men of color, relying on the legislature that permitted them to enjoy the opportunity for a free French education. So while there wasn't a central school on the island, he actually wrote to the Minister of the Marines and Colonies to say this would be an opportunity for France to show its benevolence by being able to take in these pupils. He was able to enlist the help of a headmaster, of a very well-educator in France, went by the name of Jean-Baptiste Coisan. And Jean-Baptiste decided to start this institute with roughly about 32 students. And we know these students were men who, sons of men who fought on the side of France, or who were members of the, offspring of the elite in Haiti at the time. And if you notice, one of the individuals who was included in that was young Marie, the son of our Philippe, who was training in the maritime industry. Now, what is also interesting about this particular scenario is that there are two additional young men that benefited from this education program that Philippe was able to get developed in France from Haiti. Isaac Louverture and his half-brother Placide Louverture were sent to France in 1797 to be educated alongside the sons of these elite Haitians and other orphans of military officials. Now, we know this because in February 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte essentially identified that while he was fighting Toussaint Louverture and his Haitian Revolution, here he was also essentially paying for the education of Toussaint's two sons. So he actually tried to use them as a way of getting Toussaint to give up the fight. And essentially, once that was unsuccessful, he essentially expelled Toussaint's two sons from France, returning them back to Haiti. Now, here's the thing. You can actually find the education records of these young men. And what was quite interesting was that we were able to find the records of young Marie Antoine while in school between the years of 1799 to 1802 in Paris. It is said that Roume was around 15 years old. He's a son of commissioner. And this is when he attended the school. And he was very excellent in his subjects, and especially that of being active on the maritime, working on ships. He behaves well, he cares a lot, he's very happy, and he's really benefited from the teaching he's received. We know that when you look at his scores in math, he scored first place in those marks. Secondly, with the ancient languages, we see that he is placed in high regard, and he was very much a very well-educated young man. Now, I shift because that's between 1799 to 1802. Young Roume is in Marie Antoine is in Paris. We also see, roughly about 2 years later, the creation of the second Supreme Council, or larger Supreme Council of France, after the original in Charleston, South Carolina. The Supreme Council of France was developed by Alexandre Auguste Grace de Tilly in 1804. And he was able to make these men that you see listed as 33rd degree members to form this Supreme Council. Now, Ironically, while I said he formed the second Supreme Council, he also had another Supreme Council, which was the Supreme Council of the French Isles of America, that he was also the Sovereign Grand Commander of. And just going through some of these names, they'll come up later, but it's just a place point. We know that others went on to help unify both the two Supreme Councils, that Auguste de Grand-Stilly, this is Eli de Caz. We know others like Jean-Jacques de Cambaceres and Jean-Baptiste Comte de Valencia. These were all men who rose to the stature of being leaders within the Supreme Council of France for the 33rd degree of Scottish Rite, as well as Grand Secretaries and General Secretaries, etc. Now, back to our gentleman here and in our storyline about young Antoine. We find in 1805 and 1807 and onwards, Marie and Elizabeth Rochade is in Paris with her children. Particularly, we know that her son is listed on her records that she provided to the government at that time. And if you notice, it says they lived in a certain address called, address which was Rue de Rochade, number 7. And they list the name of her son as Marie Antoine Nicolas Jacquin. And if you look again at the dates of birth and the ages, it's actually showing her listing his age given the 1784 date of birth and not the 1774 change that was done on the adoption papers. Now, here's where things take an interesting turn. In 1807, in the lodge called the Star Lily, young Marie Antoine Jacquin is shown as a member of this particular lodge with the occupation that he has listed as being a mariner, meaning working in the shipping industry. He also has the 33rd degree, where it clearly says Masonically he has accomplished that degree. Now, we know also that he ran into trouble in that lodge, where he was essentially removed from the lodge membership. He and others fought that removal, but then they petitioned in 1807 and 1808 to start a new lodge called the Commanders of Mount Tabor, where we see Roume Marie Antoine becomes listed as both the second officer, the senior warden of this lodge, where he's shown once again with the address of Rue Rochade number 7 in Paris. He's also listed this time, instead of being a mariner, as an employee of the Secretary of State, which is another conversation I'll be entertaining in a few seconds. You see, in 1810, he gets married. And he marries into, to some extent, a very comfortable life. His father-in-law is a magistrate in the district of Roume, and he essentially lands a very nice job as a special receiver or tax collector in that district. And here you see this record of his marriage in 1810, and it still shows his address as number 7 Rochard Street in Paris. Now, all is not well with respect to his cushy landing, his ability to have enjoyed the riches of life. You see, though he received this job by virtue of his father-in-law, he never shows up to work. In fact, there's a letter complaining about the fact that he was always absent on the job. So one would question, well, what was it about Marie Antoine, such an intelligent fellow, that he was able to get this nice job, but yet he never shows up? We do know that he had a very active participation in Freemasonry. As I mentioned, he was a member of the Lodge of Star Lily till he was kicked out of that. He was an active member of the Lodge of Commanders in Mount Tabor. He was very active in the lodge called Students of Nature in Haiti. And we see, going back to this 33rd degree, that he was carrying the mantle in the leadership of the Supreme Council of Terra Firma, and also having membership in Supreme Council of France, and also in the Mizraim degrees that were very popular at that time in Paris. Now, when you look at the documents that are contained in Count Grastilly's book, meaning it's called the Golden Book, essentially a document that records much of the transaction by virtue of him being the 33rd degree, and as well as a sovereign grand commander of his Supreme Grand Council. And in translations and actual documents that we see of Count Grastilly's Golden Book, the following appears. They mention at one point in time of the desire among the French brothers to form a Grand Scottish Rite Orient, which would make Grastilly as the Grand Master, and essentially merge the Supreme Council of France with Grastilly's Supreme Council of the French Islands. That same day, there was a delegation that was sent to the assembly to explore this union with the Grand Orient of France. Now, that proposal was not necessarily successful because there were several battles happening between the Grand Orient versus the Supreme Council and who wanted to maintain supremacy over the 33rd degree, or I should say the Scottish Rite degrees. Nonetheless, the delegates that are listed in Grastilly's book going to make this recommendation were a gentleman by the name of Magellan, a gentleman by the name of Bressant, and our Marie-Antoine Roume de Saint Laurent. Interesting. We see that he's listed as a member, and here's his signature as part of this delegation and part of the membership of the Supreme Council of France. We know that in 1816, Grastilly gives him the authority to stand in his I guess he was in prison at the time. So in his stead, in his replacement, he gives the authority of Roume, Marie-Antoine Saint Laurent, the opportunity to represent him in his absence. Also given the fact that he has his own title of being the Sovereign Grand Commander of Terra Firma. And here is recorded to the extent in 1816 that the Supreme Council acknowledges both Roume de Saint Laurent as being a 33rd and active member of their Supreme Council. Now, you're going to say, I'm throwing all these terms around. So let me just pull back a second and give you some geographical explanation as to where things were and what they were called during that period of time. This was how the world looked during those colonial times in the 1800s. And in particular, in the region that we're speaking about, we know this is Saint-Domingue here in the middle, otherwise Haiti. Haiti, and of course, the Dominican Republic, as we know it now. But if you notice, the area that is being talked about, the area of New Spain, which is essentially Central America, Terra Firma, which is the northern part of South America, and of course, the French Isles or the French Antilles. So here you have, when you think about the region that's being discussed as far as falling under the domain of Roume Saint Laurent under his Supreme Council, his Supreme Council was essentially covering the area of New Spain, Terra Firma, as well as other portions of the French Isles, while at the same token, Grastilly has his own French Isles that he also had a Supreme Grand Council as leader over. Now, what is interesting is that the Canary Islands is included in Saint Laurent's umbrella. We know this because in 1816, we find records of him granting a charter to the first lodge in the Canary Islands, essentially given permission for them to confer up to the Rose Croix or 18th degree, as well as other high-grade Scottish Rite degrees. He also makes the requirement that they swear an oath of fealty to him and the Supreme Council and advises them to stay away from the Grand Orient. Once again, this is illustrative of the arguments that were happening between the various Supreme Councils and the Grand Orient at that time. We also know in 1818, our Count Roume de Saint Laurent is in a secret order called the Sublime Military Order of American Pacifiers, where he has the position of a chevalier or knight prince of the tropic. Now, what is interesting about these men, they formed a secret order whose goal was to return back to Haiti and reclaim the lands that they lost or their fathers lost by virtue of the Haitian Revolution. So it is quite interesting that here you have a secret order within that order, and the membership, they all had to be 30, or they all were 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons. Now, Roume leaves Paris. But before he does that, and this goes back to the forward-thinking approach of Philippe, he petitions to the French government for all of the records and all of the indulgences that was gifted to him by virtue of Philippe's name, title, and rank and order. So now he had the rightful claim to those particular materials. And here is his written request where he actually asked for that. And as you can see, he writes, and his name is now Roume Count de Saint Laurent. Now, We know in 1822, back now in Saint-Domingue, he is very active and he gathers other Black Masons together to petition the Provincial Grand Lodge of England to form a new lodge called the Students of Nature. The Grand Lodge of England doesn't permit or doesn't give this charter. So then he goes back to what he knows best, which is the Supreme Council of America in the French islands, as he knew it, where he submitted for this petition. But it had since merged with the Supreme Council of France. So the approval came in May 1822 from the Supreme Council of France, given this charter and requesting that Saint Laurent, Marie Antoine, do the installation of that lodge, which he performs on December 27th, 1822. This is a lodge of men who are predominantly men of color. Now, we know this because he still appears as a member of Grastilly Supreme Council. We know that in 1822, the General Secretary, Brother Mourir, also writes that they're accepting him as a honorary member and sends him mentions in 1821 that they're sending him his patent. We see that they wanted to recognize his capacity, but also the fact that he's already has the high honor of the Supreme Council, which he himself leads. We know this because our guy in 1823 is now writing very extensively, showing his great honorific titles. And here you see his name. He talks about all of the Supreme Council that he's a member of. And of course, you see the seal of his Supreme Council at that time. Now, in Haiti, there's another great giant at this time called Jean-Pierre Boyer. And Boyer and Saint Laurent had a very interesting interaction. In fact, in 1823, it is our Marie Antoine Saint Laurent who is writing back to the Supreme Council of France, requesting that they give Jean-Pierre Boyer this great title called the Grand Protector of Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite in Haiti, especially seeing that he was the first president of the Republic. And he asked them in this request to send the charter or the warrant or the dispensation to him so that he can present it on behalf of the Supreme Council to President Jean-Pierre Boyer. And we know this because if you look in any of the records of the Grand Orient of Haiti, or as you see here, it is shown very clearly that the Grand Protector of the Order is listed as none other as Jean-Pierre Boyer, President of Haiti. And the reason he got this title was because of our Marie Antoine Roume, Count de Saint Laurent. But just as his father experienced when he had a negative interaction with Toussaint Louverture, we also find that our Marie Antoine gets into trouble with the leadership on the island at that time. In 1831, while he was living with his sister and working as a registrar for the government and a mortgage curator, he gets into a legal battle with one of Toussaint's right-hand men, specifically General Ignac and Ignac's family. Boyer puts him and several others in jail and bring them on trial for sedition in April 3rd, 23rd of 1831. For whatever reason, they miraculously got acquitted. And our Marie Antoine didn't waste any time. He got out of Haiti as quickly as possible, taking a ship from Port-au-Prince, Haiti to Philadelphia on June 3rd, 1831. We know that because we're able to find the record of his transmission and his voyage from Haiti to Philadelphia. And you can see here, Mr. the Count Saint Laurent, and of course, the dubious age of 28 at the time, but showing that he left from Port-au-Prince to Philadelphia on a schooner by the name of the Atlas. He says that once he arrives in Philadelphia and then moves later on to New York, that he lost some of his archives and recopies his golden book, which we know now is conserved in the archives of the Grand Lodge of Philadelphia. Now, he didn't just stay in Philadelphia, as I mentioned. We find in 1832, going back to how I first started this conversation, he endeavors to form a union with other Supreme Councils at that time. And when he was traveling throughout the country, and especially he got to New York, he found out that several of the New York lodges and the Scottish Rite and all these other elements were not operating as much, especially as a result of the Morgan affair. And there was a significant, huge cholera outbreak that essentially shut down a lot of the lodge activity at that time. But he did find a Surno Supreme Council, which was started in 1812, and he essentially merged with that Supreme Council after writing several letters to all of the Supreme Councils, both in the South and in the North. And Surno responded, or the Surno Supreme Council, I said, responded. And he essentially creates a new unified Supreme Council called the United Supreme Council of the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is interesting because in a couple years later, he also develops the first recorded international conference of Supreme Councils and develop a treaty of alliance between France, Brazil, Belgium, and his new United Supreme Council. And here you see, you exchange, they had memberships in both the French Council, the Brazilian Council, all those elements. We also know that Marquis de Saint Lafayette, who dies in 1834, was also made an active member of their Supreme Council and was the liaison between the Supreme Council of Western Hemisphere and back to France. And they were the first body to write back and give a notification of Lafayette's death, recorded back on May 20th, 1834. Now, what is interesting about the 1834 alliance? A couple things. He references the Grand Constitutions in Latin, the first time we see it in Latin. And he also references all these other folks that he said are active members of his Supreme Council, which include a brother by the name of Galvez, Prince Chambeseries, and a few others, including Grace Tilly. Now, how do we know all this stuff is happening? How do we prove this? We actually find other evidence of Roume in regular French society. So there's this gentleman who was a well-known poet by the name of Pierre Saint-Isaïe. In 1834, he writes that he attends a wedding. And in this wedding, he met this serious man with very good manners by the name of Mr. Saint Laurent, who was a high dignitary and seems to have traveled very well in Freemasonry. And Laurent tells him, as Pierre and he are having this conversation, Laurent says that you're the most truest and worthy man that I know. You're just missing the ceremony of being initiated as a Freemason. This was the touch point that Pierre says and writes that allowed him to now go seek out Freemasonry and become initiated himself as a Freemason. Now, back in Paris, we see that he doesn't, of course, stay in New York or in Philadelphia. He returns back because in 1840 we see him attending the quarterly meetings of the Supreme Council of France. He shows up where he actually is recorded in the minutes of providing policy changes and recommendations of changing the fees for the degrees. We see that he votes for Baron James de Rothschild, to receive the 33rd degree. And Saint Laurent actually votes in approval of that as well. We know that he has shown up and even brought forth some presentations. And then the interesting thing of how this really comes full circle. We also know in the African American community, specifically the Scottish Rite, that Scottish Rite Freemasonry pretty much appeared around the 1820s. But it is in the 1850s that we see the first Black 33rd degree by the name of brother by the name of David Leary, receiving his 33rd degree by virtue of Saint Laurent or Saint Laurent Supreme Council, and his references being made a 33rd. Now, what is interesting between the 1880s time period, there were several Supreme Councils that appeared across the African American community, as with any fracture that occurs with the beginning of Freemasonry. But we do know that they merge, and the majority of them merge into two distinct Supreme Councils, one called the United Supreme Council for the Northern Jurisdiction, and the second, the United Supreme Council for the Southern Jurisdiction. This is what we now know as the Prince Hall Scottish Rite Supreme Councils that exists in the United States of America. And what is very interesting about this point, if you take a look at their names, the United Supreme Council is a direct homage and a direct tip of the hat to their, their progenitor, which was Count de Laurent's United Supreme Council of the Western Hemisphere. Now, Folger and others write extensively about Laurent, the fact that he was very much into tolerance and wanted to ensure that people of color got access to this ritual, this degree system, and should not be separated on the grounds of race. We know that he had very prominent members of his Supreme Council, men who were very high representatives in Haiti, like Harry Dupont Franklin, Pierre-Émile Barrière. We know that he has listed other past dignitaries as honorary members of the Supreme Council, like Count Galvez, who we know was much older at the time and was around the time where his father had existed, who also is where the namesake of Galveston, Texas comes from. We know that he speaks about Don Francisco Cervera de Sangroni, who had also fought and was connected to the Galvez family and to Grass Tilly. But we also see that Laurent was a very active Scottish Rite 33rd degree Mason. He continued over the course of time while in Paris to both visit the conventions and really present himself as being an active member. We know this, which is also interesting. In 1855, the Charleston Supreme Council sends a representative by the name of Dr. Bignon, who makes a recommendation or a petition for the Supreme Council of France to recognize the Charleston Supreme Council as a enamity, as a recognition body. And what is interesting about that is that the Supreme Council of France puts two gentlemen, one by the name of Giffrey and the other, our Marie Antoine, to go investigate this request. Everything comes full circle. But it is in 1857 that our Saint Laurent Marie Antoine dies. And this is recorded in the minutes of the Supreme Council of France. We know that he is buried in the Paris the Paris Church of Saint Philip the Roume, which is in the outskirts of Paris, and unfortunately, he didn't seem to have had let's say a decent burial. He was buried in an area of the plot for the burial in that parish that essentially went for those who were not necessarily rich or basically the potter's field. One last point I want to stress about this. You see this item here, which is called the Grand Decoration of the Order. And if you can see my video, I actually have mine when I became a 33rd degree as well. This Grand Decoration, which is the jewel, for lack of a better word, the 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons receive across this world. This Grand Decoration was never listed in any of the documents that were shown in the Supreme Council of Charleston, South Carolina, which is the mother council of the 33rd degree. It is first described in St. Laurent's Latin version of the Grand Constitutions of 1786. So everyone who is a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason who has this jewel, which is the Grand Decoration of the Order, have to thank our Count Marie Antoine Saint Laurent for having this version written into the Grand Constitutions that he preserved in his Golden Book. So this is the legacy of our Count Saint Laurent. He was a man of color, a man of African descent, who navigated the seas of high society and Freemasonry, who was just as empowered as other notable legends that we know of Freemasonry and the craft, who supported the growth of Scottish Rite in the midst of significant socio-political turmoil in several countries, be it Haiti, be it Philadelphia or New York City, and of course in Paris. And he's also wrongly misinterpreted and described as a fraud and an imposter and a charlatan. He was none of the above. He did use his influence and knowledge to expose the Scottish Rite to other men of color. And for that fact, he is, as we now know him, as one of the patrons of the Scottish Rite in Prince Hall, and of course, having a significant wider reach into Scottish Rite Freemasonry as a whole. Thank you. Gives my acknowledgement to fellow researchers and other colleagues. And I really appreciate this opportunity to present this program and this lecture for you today. As was mentioned, just if you have questions, you can raise them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and I believe the moderator would do his best to call on folks, and I will answer questions as best as possible. I know it was a lot of information I threw at you. And being a New Yorker, I hope I didn't speak too fast. Brother Belton. 1 second, let's unmute you.
Okay, I should be unmuted now. It sounds immensely complicated, and the more I look into Supreme Councils, the more Supreme Councils I seem to find. Is it everything was going crazy, was it, at this time? Because I know there were sort of 3 up in New York almost at one time, and they came and they went. How on earth do you keep track of it and discover who belonged to which one?
You know, the Supreme Councils, I think in their infinite wisdom, adopted this motto of order out of chaos, because it is literally order out of chaos. It takes a lot from a genetic standpoint to try to track and trace, because if you don't pay attention, you would miss the fact that the rivalry with respect to the Scottish Rite, especially in France, was quite remarkable. The Grand Orient made a move to maintain possession, but the Supreme Council of France also existed. The Supreme Council of France even created its own subordinate Grand Lodge to maintain the craft rituals while it preserved the Scottish Rite. And then, as I mentioned, you have Grastilly, who has his own Supreme Council of the French islands in the French territories. And then, of course, here comes our Count of Roume, who has everything else. So a lot of this stuff is happening, and I think it is part, of course, the wild frontier of Freemasonry. But it does take a lot of patience to be able to track, trace, and hopefully make the necessary connections. In fact, I was able to work with some friends and some brothers in French who were looking at it on the side of France while we were looking at the side of America, and having the ability to connect the dots, getting his adoption record, showing that he was in Philadelphia, and all these other things, I think really helped to paint a more comprehensive picture of this fellow.
And I do have one more question. You talked about he was in Trinidad. So what did he do? Did he do anything Masonic in Port of Spain, Trinidad?
So that would have been his stepfather, Philippe. Philippe was in Trinidad. So Philippe left Grenada, went to Trinidad, helped set up the first census in Trinidad, and then Philippe leaves Trinidad and goes to Haiti. So the records that we know of Freemasonry in Trinidad at that time would not have been in place for him to be able to do anything Masonically. Philippe rose. And specifically, we do know the first lodges that appeared in Trinidad were French lodges, but they were not necessarily tied to Philippe at that time. He had since left and was set up shop as being active in Haiti, and then from Paris to Haiti.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have another question here. Why was a question asked was why the age change? The interpretation of the age change, like why was it important to make him 10 years older than he was? We believe that it is as a result of the laws at that time, which if you were at a certain age, it permitted the adopted, especially children of color who were adopted by the parents, to gain the benefit of both their names and their ownership, or I should say their inheritance to that extent. And had especially seen that there was a shift in the political structure at that time. Had he been younger, he would not have had the opportunity to make that claim against Philippe's inheritance or Philippe's authority to that extent. So that's the running hypothesis with respect to why the name change, because ultimately it made him older than he was, but it also entitled him, as we see later, for him to be able to make the petition to receive all of the records and all of the materials that were afforded Philippe Rose, so that he can claim title to those indulgences as well. The question is about Prince Hall Scottish Rite to Prince Hall Freemasonry. As with any of the Freemasonic organizations, in the United States of America, the Scottish Rite is what is considered an independent body of Freemasonry. So think of it as a pie. In the middle of the pie, or the middle of the circle, is the craft lodges and the grand lodges. Once you're a member of a craft lodge, you are able to join several what we call appendant or concordant bodies in the United States of America. So the difference between the U.S. and other portions of the world, you don't go through you are not able to go through Freemasonry entirely under the Scottish Rite. You must go through the craft lodge first and foremost, the Grand Lodge. So in reality, the Scottish Rite, and it's the same thing with Prince Hall, once you're a third degree Master Mason in Prince Hall, you can become and petition to join the Prince Hall Scottish Rite wherever you exist. So that's the relationship between the two. Just checking to see. I'm scrolling quickly through some of the other questions here. Just give me a second. It's not just the age change. Yes, there's a lot of information. Okay, Sylvia asks, according to Aurelia Michelle in 2020 in her book, The World of Black and White, the Coens had to create the black construct to ensure their workforce. She dates 1830 to 1850 from slavery to race. I may be absolutely wrong, but my gut feeling is that these new laws on racial construct had a lot to do with this man's movements and exclusion from lodges. Well, in actuality, in the time period of the 1830s to the 1850s, he's in Paris, and he's very active in Freemasonry, as I showed in the Scottish Rite. And his movement with respect to what happened in the 1830s wasn't necessarily tied to racial issues in Haiti. It was actually because he got into I would say, a legal debate with respect to the General Ignac's family in Haiti. And when he got thrown in jail in 1831, 1832, he essentially, recognizes that, they had his life in their hands. So once he was able, you think about it, the president of the republic and his second, his right-hand man have you in jail and brought up on trial of sedition, you're not going to stick around. So he leaves Haiti and he goes to New York. And we know this because Philadelphia, then New York. In Philadelphia, by virtue of what has been happening over the series of several revolutions that have been happening in Haiti, there have been a huge contingent of Haitian Americans who basically transplanted themselves both into South Carolina and also into Philadelphia. So the fact that he leaves Haiti and goes to Philadelphia and later, takes a trip to New York, just shows that the degree and his ability to rapidly move around. So the issues of race and the issues of slavery at that time would not have been germane to his particular scenario because he was living in Haiti, which was the first free Black republic. And then, of course, moving around in Philadelphia to New York, and then subsequently back to Paris. So, that's just my perspective on that question. Okay, I'm just scanning to see if there are any hands raised. Seeing none, I'm just going to go through the chat questions. Forgive me. Is there some form of record of his nondescript burial as an attempt to discredit his legacy? No, I just think his nondescript burial was because he didn't have money. and was not able to afford a very nice plot to be buried in. And we noticed because, if you remember, I mentioned he never showed up to work. So he essentially lost his job. And we also see that his wife, or his estranged wife, either she remarries or she's buried in a totally different portion, totally different location than where he is. So the general premise is that he, either was thriving off of what he was afforded by being able to be sovereign grand commander and charter lodges, because he did help charter lodges. He did, earn some sort of income, and he obviously lived off of his stepfather's, inheritance to some extent. But ultimately, his nondescript burial was not an effort, because when he died, as I showed you in the minutes, his Supreme Council wrote extensively about his legacy and their admiration for his membership. So it wasn't an attempt in that regard. I would say that, as with anything, we see a lot of whitewashing of the contributions of people of color in history. So he, as with other men of color, were essentially written out of a lot of the history to the point where we only see him spoken about in negative terms. Once we look at Folger and Don and of course even Gorgas, and it took a lot of time to go back to say there's something more about this guy, because he couldn't be as bad as they say, when in fact he was no different than some of the other folks who were out there spreading it from spreading their version of the craft from their perspective. All right, the next question is about the rituals. Is there a single ritual, or are there many local versions? Well, in the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, there were several different versions, I would say, of the craft rituals. Everyone did the craft rituals, and you had, whether it was Mizraim Rite, the high grade, there was either the premise that you have your interdependence fellowcraft and Master Mason degree. And for the most part, everyone followed the similar rituals, getting up to the Rose Croix. It is, of course, the creation of the Supreme Council of the Mother Supreme Council in South Carolina, where we see the development, the creation of the 33rd degree. The argument has been that Charleston was the one to create the 33rd degree, and others try to copy it. And then there's some who said, well, no, other people had a 33rd degree. But for the most, and the highest impression, the 33rd degree, as we know it now, was developed and inspired through Charleston, and it spread out from that point, whether Grass Tilly took it, brought it back to Paris, brought it back to other portions, and made 33rd degree Masons, or made Masons 33rd degree, and created the Supreme Council of France and onwards. So there was a lot of degree selling going on as well. As we see this with Grass Tilly, he himself were making people 33rd degrees, and he was even admonished by men in America saying, like, Grass Tilly's basically selling us out, and just giving 33rds wherever he could make money off of. So you think about that as a means of financial incentive. But in reality, the rituals that do exist are not necessarily that dissimilar from each other. But once again, the creation of the Supreme Council was an effort to bring chaos and bring all these bodies together in a way that minimized the rush on the degree sales that were happening at that time. All right. Yes, Brother Kaya, do you have a question? I see your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, proceed.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, Brother Kaya from Istanbul, greetings. First of all, Brother Alleyne, thank you very much for this fantastic presentation. It must have been a real task, and I believe also an adventure to put together all the pieces with all these documents across the world, actually, presenting his legacy and also his important role for Freemasonry in general, and I believe for Prince Hall Masonry in particular, at least in the United States. For me, it was very instructive. I learned a lot, new things, actually. Two short questions. First question, I I believe his legacy in the United States is, of course, due to the Prince Hall Masonry also quite recognized or accepted. How about the recognition of his legacy in France? That would be my first, as of today. And the second question, did he have, has he left any descendants, any children which may have also, I don't know, being members of Freemasonry, as far as you know? Thank you.
We don't have. Thank you. We don't have any records of him having any children, at least. Yes, I have not seen any records of him having any children. We know that, as I said, he kind of was separated or estranged from his wife, but there's no evidence of having children at the time of his death at all. With respect to this recognition in France, I did work very closely with several brothers from the Supreme Council of France, and we've had other conversation with other historians of Scottish Rite throughout France. I presented portions of this presentation at the conference on Freemasonry and research lodges at that time. So there was a significant interest, and is a significant interest in Saint Laurent and much of the story that's been said about him. So I think definitively having the two sides of the world, the globe, come together to at least provide both comprehensive information and help each other out has been to develop to the benefit of getting a much richer history and story of Saint Laurent. So there is movement. I mean, I'm trying to publish a book and also provide that opportunity and support to the brothers in France and others who want to be able to read more about the story and really have this commitment to ensuring that we don't lose the unsung story of this great individual who, for any other benefit, would have probably gone, lightly spoken of. I think you said, brother, who was it? Roger, was it? 1 second, let me find him. Roger Martin, where's Roger Martin? There he is. 1 second. Ask you to unmute. There you go. Yes, you can go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes, Brother Martin.
Well, good evening. And the first thing, of course, is we have to thank you, all of us, for this most remarkable piece of work you've done. And you made clear to us a lot of very complicated problems. And I think we should all be very thankful to you, because this is a part of a history which is extremely complicated and where it's so welcome to hear a voice like yours in all its objectivity. And I must confess, I have let's say a half political remark also. And of course, I'm Belgian, I'm a European. And my impression is anyway, that if you look at the attitude of Freemasonry in Europe, we must say I'm quite proud to have been a European in that period, because we in Europe were much more open and we were much righter than in other parts of the world towards brethren of color. And it may be a bit childish to say that, but that's how I feel after your remarkable work of today. I'm sorry to be a bit childish, maybe, to make a remark like that, because it is really saying, oh, we are quite good in the end in Europe. But anyway, that came up. It's an automatic thing. I'm sorry. I'm a man of feeling. more than some others. So thank you for hearing to me.
C'est vraiment frère. Thank you very much. Are there any additional questions? Either raise hands or chat. And I'm trying to be a Superman here and jump between different screens. As I mentioned, I recognize it was an extensive amount of details, so a lot to be digested. Okay. Hearing no other questions or seeing no other questions, we do thank you for being able to join us this evening, this afternoon, wherever time period it may be where you are. And we at least hope that this was a eventful, educational, and enlightening period of time. And it is my gratitude to the organizers to be able to participate in this great series called the Open Lectures on Freemasonry. God bless you and have a great and remarkable evening.